Hello, and welcome to this brand new Blender Smoothie tutorial. This is Ben Amond, and today we're going to pick up where we left off last in this fantasy weapon tutorial series. So right now I have open the file that we just completed from the last part, where we finished up all the modeling. I tweaked it a little bit more. I ended up scaling down this blade and the rest of these as well, to adjust the proportions a little bit more, essentially. So that it didn't quite look like it would snap in half when you swung it. It still kinda does, but maybe we can tweak that a little more later. So in this part we're going to be working on the background and the lighting. So the first step I want to address is the background, in which case we don't actually need this open right now, because we're going to work on this separately. So what I want to do basically is to start a new .blend file, and through the compositing nodes create a suitable background for this that we can then composite into this in the final render. So basically, first thing we need to do is just open up another instance of Blender, and you can delete the cube, delete the light, whatever you want to do. It doesn't really matter because we're not actually going to be using any of the scene data in this, or even the render layer. So all we need to worry about right now before we render this are the dimensions. And let me go ahead and adjust these. So let's make this 1000 just to start out with, so we can kind of tweak this value a little bit until we get something that we like. I think around 1350 for the Y will work. So that's 1000 by 1350. And we don't want this to be 50% either. We can drag this all the way up to 100%. We might even make that bigger later on, just because we want to make sure it's big enough for any size that we're going to be rendering the actual scythe in. So let's go ahead and render this really quickly. Just a pretty fast render. Has the cube there, doesn't matter. I'm going to go up here to this button here to switch from the default setup to the compositing setup. And I'm going to hover over these diagonal lines right here and merge those windows, and merge these windows as well. And I'm going to check use nodes so that we can start working with the nodes here, and turn on backdrop so that when we add a viewer node we can see a backdrop of what we're working on back there. So, like I said before, we're not using render layers in this. We're going to be creating this background entirely from the nodes in this editor, and textures and whatnot. So we can just go ahead and delete this to start with. No need for that. And I am going to start out with a texture, I think. So let's go ahead and press Shift-A, hover over Input, and add a texture. And the idea I have for this background is sort of a dark purple colored kind of thing with a lighter spot on the inside and maybe darker edges and sort of a cloudy texture in it. So let's start with a lighter area in the center. So to do that, I think it would probably be best to come over here to the texture options, add a new texture, and we'll change this from clouds to blend. And the reason I'm using blend is if we go to, let's see here, yes, under progression right here, it's set to linear by default. If we change this from linear to spherical, then we have a spherical blend. So it's a circle-shaped blend, and it's a nice gradient that goes from the center out. So we'll have a nice lighter spot in the image with sort of darker corners. Kind of like a vignette, but we're not quite creating it in that way. So we can go ahead and load that texture that we just created here. And I'm actually going to go to Colors. We'll turn on Ramp, just because I want to be able to adjust this option right here from linear to ease, because that's a bit of a smoother transition. Alright, so what we need to do from here, if I were to go ahead and add a viewer node, so pressing Shift-A and hovering over Output and adding viewer, plug that into the image, we'll see that it worked, but it's kind of stretched vertically. That's because of the dimensions we chose. The image is taller than it is wide instead of perfectly square. So we're going to have to edit the scale to compensate for the dimensions. So we scaled it longer along the y-axis than we did on the x, hence the fact that it's 1350 along the y and only 1000 along the x. So we need to do the same with the texture. So all that means is x is 1000, here the x scale is 1, so we just need to adjust those in proportion to each other. So since y is 1350, here y should be 1.35. And as you can see, it evens it out, so now it's a nice perfect circle. Alright, so we've got that, and now we need to start incorporating this into the actual image, because obviously this won't make a very good background, just sort of a white dot. We need to add some color to this and some other stuff to sort of fill it in. So I'm going to be mixing this with an RGB value. So I'm going to go ahead and press Shift-A, hover over Input, add RGB. And I want kind of a dark purplish color. I think the hex value I use, I have it written down here just so that we can sort of keep things consistent. I used 45264F. So as you can see, that's a pretty dark purple color. And basically, this is going to be the general color of the entire background. It's just going to have some lighter spots and some darker spots. So I want to mix these together in some way so that there's a lighter purple in the center and a darker purple on the outside. To do that, I would like to use a clouds texture as a mixing factor, so that basically we have some lighter spots and some darker spots, but it's not just defined by this blend texture. There's also some variety in there with the clouds texture. That'll make a little more sense once I actually start working with it. So let's press Shift-A, hover over Input, add another texture, come over here to the Textures panel, and let's see here. Let's just click this texture icon right here and load this default texture. It should be in there by default, just text. And you can change the type from none to clouds. And really the only thing I want to do with this in the actual texture settings is adjust the depth. Because right now it's not very, there aren't too many levels to it, so it's kind of a smooth texture. We want to add more detail to it. So I'm just going to turn up the depth. It probably doesn't have to be that high. We'll start out with something like 12, and we can adjust that later on if we have to. Then I can go ahead and load that from in here. And if we drop this into the viewer node, we can see that we have the same problem with this as we did with the blend texture, where it's stretched vertically. So again, all we need to do is click on Scale and change the Y value from 1 to 1.35, again, to match the dimensions that we have. And so now the cloud texture looks much more normal. So what I want to do here is find a way to combine all of these under this color, essentially, with different light and dark values and whatnot, but this same general color. So the first thing I'm going to do is, I think I'm actually going to blur this blend texture a little bit, because I still think it's a little too sharp. So I'm going to go ahead and press Shift-A and add a filter blur node, and I'm going to change this from Gaussian to fast Gaussian. And we'll set the X and Y values to, let's start out with like 500. We'll see how that looks. And as you can see, immediately it's a lot more diffused. It's spread out a lot. It's not nearly as, there's not as much contrast as there was beforehand. I might even go a little higher, like 600 by 600. Maybe we'll tweak that later when we, move on with the image here. Alright, so again, I want to combine these all under this color. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press Shift-A, hover over Color, add a Mix node. And let's start out by mixing this and this. So as you can see, it's mixed sort of that general blend texture with this color. The only problem is it's not very evenly, or it's too evenly distributed because it's set to mix instead of another factor. So basically we have it at mix, it's just mixing the two. What I really want is to add the two on top of each other. Because right now, actually, it's at 1, so we're not even seeing the gradient there. Now we're seeing the mix of the gradient and the color. But it doesn't look quite right, because we don't want part of the gradient and part of the color. We want as much of both as we can get. So I'm going to change this from mix to add. And I'm going to use this texture here as the factor. And let's see here. I think we might want to flip these around. That there. And that there. There we go. So if you're having that problem, just flip around the inputs there and it should work out just fine. So as you can see, it's sort of used this cloud texture to mix this gradient with this color. So it gets sort of lighter the closer to the center it gets, and then the white sort of fades out the farther to the edges of the image it gets, which is really exactly what I wanted. It is pretty strong though, so I might sort of work with that a little bit more. I think a good way to work with this is to add another mix node and just mix this with the default color. And we can set the factor to be like 0.5 or something. So basically this is just remixing what we already mixed. So it's just adding more of this purple color as a stronger influence. Okay, so it's not quite as intense now, so it looks a lot better. But I think I want to do one other thing. First of all, I'm going to adjust the depth a little bit more, because I think it's not quite as sharp as it could be. That looks a little bit better. It's really fine detail that you're not going to be able to see in the video, but tweak the depth to whatever value you want it to be. I think finally I'm going to add a vignette. After I blur this out a little bit more, let's try 625. Alright. Yeah, so let's go ahead and add a vignette. So that'll emphasize sort of the darker corners. It might help make the background stand out a little more. Oops. So I'm just going to go ahead and press Shift-A, hover over Distort, add a lens distortion node, bring the distortion all the way up to 1, add a converter math node, plug that into the first value, change this to greater than, and set the value to 0. This basically isolates. Let me see if I can sort of plug this into the viewer node so we can see what this is doing here. So this is basically saying that everything... Hang on, let me go back a little bit. So what we're doing here with the math node is just basically isolating. As you can see, we've still sort of got parts of the cloud texture in there. So that's basically adjusted with this value, I guess. So we're essentially isolating the dark edges of the lens distortion by lowering the value so low that nothing in the image is as dark as this. If we had some like sort of black texture parts in there that were totally solid black, then this wouldn't work. But since the darkest parts of the image are the corners of the image created by this lens distortion node, then it works out just fine. And we can go ahead and add a blur node to blur this out. Try something like 200 to start with. See how that goes. And I kind of need to move all these over a little more, just to make room for one more node. And let's go ahead and add a mix node, change that from mix to multiply. And we'll plug this into the second input there. Alright, we could probably, first of all, let's zoom out a little bit. Press V on your keyboard to zoom out. As we can see, it's a little too sharp still, so we want to blur that a lot more, maybe more like 500 by 500. To sort of diffuse that a little more. And that looks a little bit better. We could probably even go a little higher than that, maybe 600 by 600. Because we really want to make sure that's spread out effectively. And I might lower this factor too to 0.8. Oops. Got the inputs mixed up there. So we'll try flipping those around. There we go. Okay, and that works pretty well. I think I'm going to increase this mix factor actually a little bit more. Just so we have a little bit less of the brightness going on in there. And that works out pretty well. So finally we're going to plug that final node into the input for the composite node so that all of this actually displays when we render it. And we can go ahead and go back to the default option, press F12 to re-render it all. And there we go. This is our background. So we're going to be applying this to our scene. And I'm just going to go ahead and press F3 and save this. We'll go ahead and I'll just create a new folder on my desktop for now. And we'll just name this Fantasy Weapon Backdrop. So we might be creating a couple more images to go with this later on. And we'll just name this Backdrop for now. Alright, so if you want, you can go ahead and save this. In my case, I don't think I'm going to because I already have the image all set up. If you think you might be going back to tweak parts of it more, definitely save it. If not, you can probably just close out, forget about it for now. Alright, so this is where we left off last. And the thing we want to do in this case, first of all, is we want to sort of position this so that it's at a good angle for the camera. We also want to set the camera dimensions to the dimensions we set for the background image. So let's go ahead and take care of those things really quickly. First of all, I'm going to go into front view by pressing 1 on my number pad. and pressing Control-Alt-0, and that will lock the camera to the view that I'm on. So now I can right-click the camera to select it, and let me turn on my screencast keys, actually, before we go any farther. Turn those on. Alright, and I'm just going to sort of press G-X to move it along the X-axis, so that we can sort of move it something like this, so that it's pretty centered there. Alright, and now we can just press B for box select, drag a box around all the weapon there, all the different parts of it, and press RX 90 to rotate it 90 degrees along the X-axis, and that just makes it so that it's actually facing the camera. But let's adjust the dimensions before we go any farther. Let's change this to 1000 by 1350. So this is going to be a very vertical image. And 200% is pretty high. Let's start with something more like 50%. We'll sort of tweak that later on too. Alright, so from here on out, you just sort of want to press S to scale it up a little bit, G to move it around, R to rotate it. I'm actually going to double tap R, and that gives you sort of a trackball rotation type thing, so that I can kind of angle it towards the camera. Just a little something like that will probably help it a lot. Alright, and I'm actually pretty happy with that position. It looks pretty good. Kind of angled towards the camera, lean to the right. It looks like a good position for it. So let's go ahead and start working on the background before we do anything else, even before we start adding the lighting, which is the next step of this. So if we were to go ahead and render this now, let's go ahead and render it. It looks pretty bad, obviously. The background is a dark gray. There's no lighting set up, but the first thing we're working on is the background. So in order to add the background, we need to add it through the compositing nodes to the final render. So in order to add a background to an image through the compositing nodes, your initial background, in this case all this gray stuff in the background, needs to be rendered transparent, so that there's nothing there but the scythe, and everything else behind it is transparent. So let's go ahead and take care of that now, and really the only thing we have to do is scroll down here in the render settings to this film category right here, and check transparent, so that now if we render it, as you can see, the background is totally transparent, as indicated by the little checkerboard pattern. So that's all there is to it, and I'm going to actually increase that from 50 to 60%, so we can make it a little bigger and work with that to get a little more detail showing up there. And now we can work on actually compositing it. Compositing the background into the image is really simple. We'll just go to the compositing nodes again. I won't even bother merging those windows, I'll just drag these down. We'll go ahead and click Use Nodes, Backdrop. Press Shift-A, add a Viewer node. Connect these two so that we can actually see what we're doing in the background there. And I'm just going to press Shift-A, go to Input, find an image. We'll go ahead and open that image that we created that was right here. And we can press Shift-A again, hover over Color, and choose Alpha Over. And all this is doing is laying one of these images over the other one. In this case, we're laying this one, the one with the weapon, since it has a transparent background, over the background image. So it should work if we just plug that into the first input, that into the second, drop that in there, or I guess it is the other way around, so we'll flip those around. And there we go. That's essentially it. You will notice one thing, though, and that is that the background is a lot larger than our actual image was. That's really simple to take care of. We can just press Shift-A, hover over Distort, add a Scale node, connect that between the image and the Alpha Over node, and instead of relative, we'll set this to render size. So that way it just adjusts the background image to whatever size render we're rendering. And then, of course, we want to plug this into the composite node. Alright, so that's really all there is to compositing the background in there. So if we go back to default, and go ahead and re-render it, the compositing brings it in, and it works really nicely. Alright, so now all we have left to do is work on the lighting. And the lighting is actually pretty simple in this case. First of all, we're going to increase the sampling on both the preview and the render to, say, 50. Just for now. Of course, the render sampling will be much higher later on, but for now that'll work. And I'm going to press Shift-A and add a plane. And this is going to be the key light. So the main light in the scene, want to move it pretty far back. Maybe something like that will probably work. We can move it later on if we have to. Move it a little farther up too. Alright. And let's switch this view from solid to rendered. Come over to the shaders panel here. Go ahead and add a new shader. Change this from diffuse to emission. Bring this color all the way up to a solid white, so that it's not at that weird gray shade it's typically at. And let's set the strength to something like 100 to start with, just to see if that's pulling anything up. And as we can see, it is. Let's try 200. Alright, so that's pretty good. The main blade is a little more shadowed than I'd like it to be, so I think I'm going to kind of move this over so that it's facing the front of it a little bit more. And we'll try that again. That's a lot better. Maybe I moved it a little too far. I'll move it over a little bit more. You don't want to move it too close to the camera, because then it starts looking like it was a flash sort of thing. Like the flash was enabled on the camera, and it doesn't look very good. That works pretty well. So this will be our main light, our key light. And we should go ahead and name that material after it. Let's call this key light. And we'll give it a slight orange tint, so that we can work with sort of the warm, cool lighting effect. Alright. And I'm going to go ahead and add another plane for our fill light. Rotate that, 90 degrees, R90. And we'll sort of move this over here. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger, just because the larger the lamp is, then the softer the shadows are in general. So I kind of want the fill light to have softer shadows than the key light, just because it's filling in the shadows. It's not really supposed to be creating many shadows. Alright. So we'll start with something like that. Go into rendered view here, add a new shader. Oops, we'll name this fill light, and we'll change it from diffuse to emission. Bring this all the way up to there, give it sort of a blue tint, and we'll set the strength to about 50. And that is way too strong, so maybe 5 to start with. And that actually looks like a pretty good value. It might still be a little too strong. I might try 4. We just want something that'll fill in the shadows nicely. Not completely, of course, because we don't want it to look shadeless. But something sort of like that works pretty well, I'd say. Maybe give it a little bit more blue in there. Alright. So, that works pretty well for our 2 main lights. And you may be wondering, what about the third light? Because generally a 3-point lighting system works best, because we would also typically have a rim light to sort of separate the object from the background a little bit more. And in this case, I've found that when rendering models like these, it typically works better to use a special feature in the shader nodes. Using the Fresnel node works a lot better than adding a rim light, or trying to add a rim light. You have a lot more control over it, and it looks better overall in these sorts of renders. So we'll go ahead and add that later when we're working with the shaders. For now, let's just focus on these main lights. And there's only really one other thing that I want to change about this, and that's that if we sort of look at the bottom, there are still some kind of dark parts along parts of the handle there and parts of the staff, especially towards the bottom there. The fill light just isn't quite reaching. So I want to take care of that, and by doing that, I'm just going to go ahead and press Shift A and add a plane, scale it up, and put it under the weapon. And basically this is just going to bounce the light back up onto the weapon. So if we go to rendered, you can see that maybe it's working a little too well. Doesn't look quite right. It's sort of filling in the shadows too effectively. So we can just go ahead and add a shader. Call this bounce. Oops, bounce light. And we'll make this sort of darker so that it's not bouncing as much light up onto the bottom of the model, because we do want this to be a fairly subtle effect. And I'd say that's pretty good. So sort of a lighter gray, but kind of close to the middle range gray shades. Alright, so that's pretty much all we have to do on the lighting for this. I'm actually going to come over here and we'll turn up the render samples to 100, and let's just render out a quick image of this. just so we can see how well we're doing. I'm actually going to make the key light a little brighter. I think maybe 230. Add a couple more samples in there. Alright, and that looks pretty good. It looks a little too bright towards the top, so maybe I would kind of move the light back a little bit so that it's not as, I don't know, it's a little more directional. I don't really want parts of the model to be lighter than other parts just because of where the light is at, or what parts of the mesh the light is closer to, so we might go ahead and change that. But other than that, it looks pretty good so far. So this is going to be our main lighting setup, and like I said, when we add the shaders later on, then we can go ahead and use that Fresnel option to sort of give it a rim lighting look, to put it apart from the background a little bit more. It doesn't need to be set apart from the background much more right now, just because it doesn't have any shaders set up, but once we add those, it'll definitely be important. So that's all for this tutorial. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something from it, and I'll see you again on the final part.